Okay, so today I want to go over this essay called Principles of Effective Research by Michael Nielsen. And this was written in 2004, so almost 16 years ago. And I think this essay has aged remarkably well. And this is a sort of work that I would want, my writings to aspire to, this sort of enduring, timeless nature, right? That it applies just as well today in 2020 as it did in 2004. And I could imagine something like this written, even decades earlier, and these principles apply. So I really like this essay for the enduring nature. But because it's so enduring, one of the trade-offs is that it's fairly abstract and general, right? Because things that are very timely, right? If Michael or someone else were writing about the latest programming framework or the latest technology and doing, some really specific thing, it'd be very specific and it'd be very concrete, but it would not likely be very enduring, would not be relevant 16 years later. But these things are very enduring and very timeless, but I think the trade-off is that it's a bit abstract. So who is Michael? So Michael is a really interesting person. I've met him once at the Recurse Center, formerly known as Hacker School, where he was a researcher in residence there. But I didn't get to talk to him too much because he was just coming back to town, and we talked for a little bit, but not in any kind of depth. I know about Michael because he's an interesting outlier in the sense that he had a long career as a traditional academic, as a theoretical physicist at a university. And he made many contributions to the traditional research literature. And he wrote some very widely read books as well. So he has a lot of credibility as an academic. And then in, in 2008, it says, in 2008, I gave up my tenured academic position in order to work as an advocate for open science. So for the past decade, he has been independent. He has worked in various kind of funded research positions and other kind of independent research positions, really doing a lot of stuff that is not as traditional in terms of academic research. Whenever there's someone who is an academic, you probably want to look up their Google Scholar page. So this is Michael's Google Scholar page. And, while metrics aren't everything, it gives you a good first pass, right? So, this book, Quantum Computation, Quantum Information, has almost 40,000 citations, which is a ton. This is a ton of citations. So it's clearly, people in the academic community found value in it and cited it a lot. And then some of these other, this is his other book, Neural Networks and Deep Learning, a more recent book, almost 2,000 citations, and then a bunch of papers that have had, almost 1,000 citations. So just looking down the paper list, it's, just at a glance, these numbers are very impressive and indicative of someone who is fairly experienced and senior in research. And obviously it's not my field, so I don't know about the contents of these papers. If you go to Google Scholar and you go to cited by, the H index is often just clicked on it. The H index is often an at a glance indicator of someone's seniority or influence in the academic community. And 53 is a very high number. 53 is, puts them at the top few percent of people in research. I won't go into details with what the H index means, but as you get higher in the H index, it gets harder to get the next one, right? So again, this is just ballpark, right? I'm not saying that numbers are everything, but I want to set the scene for reading this essay. So basically, an H index of 53 and all these articles and books with a lot of citations, it basically is an indicator that, he knows what he's talking about in terms of an academic research career, right? If someone were writing this essay and they have no Google Scholar page, or they're some random schmo with no citations and, very low H index, then it's not bad or anything, but it just, it means that they're coming from a place that their opinion is not as well honed to research as a career. So basically that's my long-winded way of saying Michael has a lot of credibility in this space, as just at a glance. I don't even know his field very well, besides what I read in popular science books. So I'm not a physicist. Okay, anyways, it's a long-winded introduction. So I want to go over this essay first of all, you should have already read. If you're watching this video, you should have already read this essay. It will take you maybe like an hour to read if you really want to digest it. You can probably read it in half an hour if you look through it pretty quickly. But if you really want to like get the essence of it, I would say spend an hour reading it. And this is not a replacement for reading the essay, so you should read the essay first before you watch the rest of this video, because otherwise it wouldn't make any sense to you. And I want to frame this video in terms of, I'm going to give it a better title, but I want to frame this video of how I interpret this essay for people who are new to research or who are relatively junior. So someone like a new undergraduate student or a new graduate student, or someone who just wants to get into research very early on. Because this essay has a lot of parts that are more relevant to people who are more senior, who have been in research for a while, who are in the middle of their career, which I think it's, I take a lot of inspiration from this. This is why, again, this is a very universal essay, which I really love. But the issue with it being so universal and timeless is that it could be fairly hard to carve apart what is the most relevant to you at each career stage. So I'm just going to go over the parts which I think are the most relevant to early career researchers, mostly students. Let me see. I just read this like an hour ago, so I have to like page everything back in my head. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I mean, all this stuff about, principles of personal behavior, proactivity, vision, discipline, I think this is all relevant. It can be challenging if you're just starting out because you don't really have a good grasp of the field. So developing these habits are hard. I didn't have very good habits in this way when I was starting out as a student. All these things are good to have. I mean, this whole, taking personal responsibility for your work and blah, blah, blah. I mean, I'm not going to rehash the essay here, but it's, I think they're all relevant. Let's see. Yeah, examples are good. Yeah, I mean, this part, I think, the closing paragraph of this first section is important. I'll read out loud. It's, in the context of research, this means constantly reminding yourself that you are the person ultimately responsible for your research effectiveness, not the institution you find yourself in, not your colleagues or supervisor or the society you're living in. All these things influence your research career and may either be a help or a hindrance. More on that later. But in the final analysis of things, if things are not working well, it is up to you to take charge and change them. I think this is really important for junior people because if you're just starting as a student, you don't have full control over everything, right? You're probably in a lab, you're probably at a certain university, you probably have a certain advisor who imposes these constraints on you, whether consciously or subconsciously, because you are just in a setting, right? Like you are just starting in a certain setting. You can't really call all the shots and control everything. But what you can do is make the most of your particular situation and do the most you can. So, one example for me is that, when I was coming up and doing my undergrad and master's thesis work, the exact field I was in wasn't the most enthralling to me, but it seemed like something that I could feasibly do. And I had an advisor that was very supportive and it was on his critical path of what he wanted to do. And they wanted to submit papers on it and stuff. And I felt like at that point in my early career, building up those skills and doing that project was the best use of my time because it would help me maximize my chances of getting into a good PhD program so that I can continue to develop that career. Okay, vision. This is a hard one, I think, for people who are junior, right? It sounds great, right? Let me just read the first part of vision. So, effective people have a vision of what they like to achieve. Ideally, such a vision incorporates both long-term values and goals as well as shorter-term goals. A good vision answers questions like, what sort of researcher would I like to become? What areas of research am I interested in? How am I going to achieve competence in those areas? Why are those areas interesting? How am I going to continue growing and expanding my horizons? What short-term steps will I take to achieve these goals? How will I balance the long-term goals with the short-term realities of the situation I find myself in? I find that for someone just starting out, these questions of bigger picture vision can be very overwhelming, and I would tend to discount that a bit. I would say don't worry about the vision thing, the V word, the vision thing too much, because again, you just don't have a great grasp of how the research community works and how the field works and stuff. And if you're like, oh, I need to have a vision, what sort of researcher do I want to be? What is the most important problem I want to work on? Those are usually not within your grasp as someone who is new. So I would not stress too much about the vision part, I guess. So I guess I would like discount this part a bit more as a junior person. I think this is extremely important as you get into your middle stages of your career. Yeah, all this stuff about big vision and stuff, I would not stress about too much. Of course, if you have one, that is great, and you can put it into action and work toward it, even though you are, fairly junior, that's great, but I wouldn't stress too much. Self-discipline. I think this is a really important section. The self-discipline section is really important. Yeah, this is really important, I think, for junior people. Social environment, I think this is really, really important. Let me just read this to you, these two paragraphs. So this is about social environment influencing self-discipline to keep going day to day with research. So the second factor affecting self-discipline is one's social environment. Researchers are typically under little immediate social pressure to produce research results. Contrast this with examples of professional athletes who often have an entire support system of coaches, managers, and trainers in place, focused around the task of increasing their effectiveness. When a researcher stays out late, sleeps in, and gets a late start, no one minds. When a professional athlete does, they are likely to receive a blast from their coach. Access to a social environment which encourages and supports the development of research skills and research excellence can make an enormous difference to all aspects of one's research, including self-discipline. The key, here's the key I want to emphasize, is to be accountable, the A word, accountable to other people. Some simple ways of achieving such accountability are to take on students, well, I guess that's in my role as an advisor, to collaborate with colleagues or to set up mentoring relationships with colleagues. So in a typical case, as a student, you find a mentor who is a more senior student or a postdoc or a research scientist or a professor and really get yourself accountable to them. I think this is critically important because, unlike, being a professional athlete or even more mundane, just being a regular employee at a company, if you're just working at a company as an employee, you probably have some pretty strong accountability because every week you're checking in with your boss or you have a team meeting and, you better be doing your job because if you're not, there's a social pressure to be like, whoa, why aren't you doing your part, right? Usually your job is fairly straightforward, right? If you're working at a company doing a certain task, your job is to do that task for that week. And at the end of the week, if your boss or your teammates check in, they're like, did you do the thing? And you're like, yeah, I did the thing. Here is the thing. Great. Okay, good job. Let's keep doing it. Let's keep doing the next thing. Here's the next thing on our to-do list. But really in research, like nobody is, unless you hold yourself accountable and you make other people hold you accountable, nobody is going to, when a researcher stays out late, sleeps in and gets a late start, no one minds. It is totally true, especially if your advisor is more senior and more busy and has, your research advisor has 500 other things to do. They're not going to be like checking in on you every day or every week saying, oh, did you do this thing? Did you do this thing? Did you do this thing? Unless, of course, like you're really on their critical path, right? Unless they are, say, a new assistant professor who needs to publish a lot in order to get tenure, then they're probably going to be on your case more. But if they're a bit more senior and a bit busier with other things, they're teaching, they're doing service work, writing rec letters, meeting with a bunch of other people, doing other sorts of consulting, everything. They're not going to be like on your case every day about, did you do your thing? So holding yourself accountable is really key. Yeah, this is all really good. Self-development, creative process. This is a really interesting section as well. So the upshot of this section is this balance between what Michael calls self-development and creative research process. So there's two kinds of activities. There's I would characterize it as the input and the output, right? So the input activity is how do you get better as a researcher? So that requires taking a lot of inputs. That requires reading a lot of papers, maybe reading essays like this to get inspired, input talking to people, just getting self-reflection, everything is very, you're taking inputs and processing them. And that kind of develops your skills and mindset. But if you only do self-development and input, you don't produce anything. You don't produce any output. And the creative research process is output oriented, right? It's working toward a specific project to write a specific paper, do a specific experiment, do a bunch of maybe grunt work tasks that leads to an experiment, to build a tool, to run a study, to coordinate with people. Very output driven, almost like you're working in a company, just doing a bunch of tasks. And the output stuff is obviously important because ultimately you need to produce research outputs. You need to produce papers in order to sustain your career. And balancing those two are really, really important. And I think that in this section for junior people, I tend to have more of an advice of an output bias. So more time spent on thinking about concrete outputs. Although it is really tough. Like I think that the best students can do both, right? Can do both good inputs and good outputs. I find that's really hard to do. And when I was a student, I didn't do a good job at it. I was very output focused and not as much input focused. So I didn't read a lot. I didn't reflect a lot. I mostly was thinking, what's the next paper I'm going to work on? And I'm going to, of course, learn and read papers and learn toward working on a really specific problem. Yeah, I just think that, especially for someone who's junior, I'm more biased toward advising them to focus more on the creative, the output process. Okay, research strength. Yeah, this is solid as well, but not as relevant for junior people, I don't think. We're about halfway through. High quality research environment. I think this is really important also. Again, I didn't do much of this in grad school. I didn't really try to set up a high quality environment where I could get really stimulated by others and such, because I think one of the issues with this, developing a high quality research environment and also this developing research strength and self-development, I don't know a good solution for this, but I know the problem. And the challenge for students in these sections, if you're reading these sections, right, high quality research environment, blah, blah, let's finish with that. The challenge is that you are day to day probably doing fairly mundane, low-level tasks, right? You're running experiments, you're writing code, you're, trying to write some papers or work towards some proofs and stuff. It's very low-level sort of mundane things, so that if your friend just came up to you and said, "What are you working on? Show me what you're working on." It doesn't look very impressive, right? It doesn't look like you're working towards some big thing. It just looks like you're grinding away, right? I mean, this term grinding, I think, is really apt here. And when you're in a grinding mindset, when you're deep in the grind, as I say, which, grad students, if you're in a output-oriented mindset, if you're in a mindset to produce research, you're going to be in the grind, deep in the grind most of the time, doing a lot of grindy work. Yeah, so when you're deep in the grind, it is so hard to put your head up and to think about these self-development things of should I organize a seminar series? Should I organize a reading group? Should I, talk to people about self-development? Should I do it's just so hard to do that because day to day, you're just thinking about the immediate grind you have in front of you. And I don't have a good solution to this because I never succeeded in being able to be deep in the grind in grad school and simultaneously pop my head up and do all the stuff around it. I think that probably some of the best grad students can do both, but I don't have a good actionable strategy for how you can possibly do both. I think, like many things, getting plenty of sleep and regular exercise and good self-discipline, everything, they're good things to say, but I think they're really hard to do. So if you can't do that, I would say don't worry about it too much and just focus on getting progress toward your next paper and such. I know this is kind of a very reductivist view on it, but again, there's trade-offs that you have to make as a junior person with limited time and mental energy. Okay, creative process. I think that, he talks about problem solvers and problem creators. I think that most junior people or grad students probably fall into the problem solver archetype, which I think is perfectly fine. So it's fine to be a problem solver if you have problems that are handed to you from above or even in well-trodden domains. I would say it's fine to go with that because that's how people traditionally start their career. I think it's really hard as an early stage student to be a problem creator. It's also much riskier because you don't know whether you can publish on it and you don't have the credibility for that. So problem solver is fine for starting out. Skill as a problem creator. This is, again, not as relevant for students because you're probably not going to be a problem creator. And of course, like, be my guest. Like, if you can do this, great. Like, you've already done better than I did in grad school, and many people did. So problem creator, I'm not going to focus on as much. I think this is more relevant for people with more experience in the field. Problem solver. Here we go. Skills of the problem solver. Okay. I think this is super relevant for grad students. So because I would say most early stage students are going to be problem solvers, I think this is most relevant. This is the part that I think is the most, I say a lot of things are relevant, but for students, assuming you have a good relationship with your advisor or mentor, this is like the one paragraph I would just say, read this over and over again, print this out on a piece of paper, stick it to your monitor, stick it to your computer monitor, put this in your office, print this out, stick it on your refrigerator, stick it everywhere. I'm going to read this. So this paragraph says, clarity, goals, and forward momentum. In my opinion, there is little that is more important in research than building forward momentum. Being clear about some goal, even if that goal is the wrong goal or the clarity is illusory, is tremendously powerful. For the most part, it's better to be doing something rather than nothing, provided, of course, that you set time aside frequently for reflection and reconsideration of your goals. Much of the time in research is spent in a fog, and taking the time to set clear goals can really help lift that fog. You know, Michael says, provided, of course, that you set time aside frequently for reflection and reconsideration of your goals. Again, like I was mentioning a few minutes ago, yes, it's great to do this, but don't worry if you can't do this too much as a junior person because you're just so fixated. I think the way to hack this, again, going with the keeping yourself accountable, is meet regularly with your research advisor or mentor and talk about these reflection things with them. So you don't have to just reflect in your head. Just ask your research advisor, are we on the right direction? Do you feel like this is a promising direction? What should we do next? That will help you kind of get over that existential angst, but just keep moving forward. I mean, this is like, I'm such like a walking cliche by this point when I tell my students, just keep moving forward. Just keep moving. Like, Finding Nemo or Finding Dory, just keep swimming, right? And it's like, how do we know we're swimming in the right direction? You don't really, but if you have a good advisor, they'll at least point you towards somewhat the right direction, right? Okay. Let's see, working on problems. Yeah, I mean, this whole thing about working on important problems, I would not stress too much about this as a junior person. I think people get really stressed out at this. They're like, oh, I'm like just starting my PhD, you know, can my PhD dissertation be so paradigm changing and so noteworthy? I want to get like a top research job. I put a lot of pressure on myself to like work on the most important problems in my field. And like, I think senior people, when they give inspiring keynote speeches or interviews or write essays like this, they often talk about these big picture things of like, what is the most important problem in your field and how can you make progress toward it? You know, it's a waste of time to work on small incremental problems. All these people are just publishing small incremental papers. You got to tackle the big things, you know, forget trying to publish, forget trying to get awards, forget trying to get a job, just do the most important thing. And while that's great for someone in like a cushy, senior, tenured, well-paid position to be able to, you know, sip lattes and say that, when you're just coming up in the research community and your CV is empty, right? Your CV doesn't look like Michael Nielsen's with an H-index of 53 and hundreds of, you know, widely cited papers. When your CV is like empty, that should not be the thing on your mind. The thing on your mind should be, how can we make progress toward problems that are in a field I'm interested in and that I can start making progress on and start submitting papers and publishing papers out of it? Because you want to build up that CV, both for your own self-esteem and self-development, and also just to like, for your own career development as well. So, I mean, to be fair to Michael, he's well aware of this, right? He's well aware of this work on big problem things, but he says, he says this right here. So he's very aware of this. I mean, he's excellent talking about this. He says, my belief is that the way to start out in a research career is by working primarily on small and relatively tractable problems where you have a good chance of success. You then continue the process of self-development, gradually working up to more important problems. So I think, he acknowledges that up front, you do need to, publish papers and make progress in your field and, build up a reputation in the research community. It's fine to not be working on, the next big thing, as long as it's, you're making progress. This is later on, right? Even later on, this is not relevant to junior people. So I just wouldn't worry about tackling the big problems. And again, there's this big selection bias. The people who write about this stuff are the ones who can tackle the big problems, are the senior people, the influential people. I mean, nobody's going to invite some, grad student to give a keynote on how they just work on an incremental problem, even though that probably better advice and more useful advice for 99% of people starting on research than a senior person saying, oh, life is short. You only get one life. Work on the most important thing. I'm yeah, that's great for you to say because you've already established yourself, but not the most actionable advice. Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is this is what Michael said up front right here. Again, he acknowledges this. I'm not saying that he's one of these people that just says only work on big problems. He clearly acknowledges the wisdom of working on small problems. So this is I guess one of the things that can go wrong. So I'm going to read this. One of the things that can go wrong is people who only attack difficult problems, right? There is a converse to the problem I've been talking about, which is people who are only interested in attacking problems that are both difficult and important. This affliction can affect people at any stage of their career, but it manifests itself in somewhat different ways in different stages. In the case of the beginner, this is like a beginner pole vaulter insisting on putting the bar 5 meters from the time they begin. So 5 meters is pretty high, rather than starting some more reasonable height. Unless exceptionally pig-headed, such a person will never learn to vault 5 meters successfully, simply because they'll never learn anything from failure at a more realistic starting height. This sounds prima facie ridiculous, but I have seen people burn out by following exactly this strategy. So again, in the beginning, just chill, work on stuff that's a bit more established. Don't stress about I might work on something that'll win a Nobel Prize. This is more, again, for more senior people, not as relevant for junior people and such. And that's it. And I think we're at pretty much 30 minutes. So, we got through this pretty well. So basically this is just kind of, me passing through Michael's essay with a particular eye on what is the most relevant to a junior researcher just starting out in their career. So, hopefully this is kind of a useful interpretation for you. I think, for myself in my point of my career, I am, I guess, depending on how you count, I'm 15 years into doing research seriously. So I guess the first work that I worked on that led to a publication was about 15 years ago. So when I read this essay for myself, I take different things from it, but I think that it'll find a much bigger audience when I try to interpret it through the lens of what advice I would give to someone who is just starting out. So hopefully you'll find this useful. Okay, until next time.